This might be the last video I ever make on birds in flight photography. Welcome to another video, and today I'm going to be giving you some extra tips on photographing birds in flight. Tip number one in today's video is to pre-focus. So by this I mean that you're going to kind of predict where the bird's going to be, or you might specifically want a bird in a certain place on its flight path. So you're actually going to pre-focus there. Now you can do this with autofocus, or you can do it with manual. It really doesn't matter, but then you're going to switch back to autofocus if you do it manually. And the reason for this is, even with the really advanced autofocus systems, I think it's a little better if you give the camera less work to do. So if you were focused on the distance, say focused on infinity on your lens, and then a bird comes much closer than that, maybe around 10 meters or so, then the autofocus has got much more work to do because it's got to move all that distance. So if you can pre-focus to roughly where the bird's going to be, it's going to make it faster for the autofocus to react. So often it's a case of just focusing on the ground at the same distance. If you can't do that, if it's the sky, then just find something you can, maybe a tree which is roughly the same distance, focus on that, and then go back to where you're expecting the bird to be. Tip number two is to use manual focus, and I can just hear a mouse squeaking. Hopefully there's a kestrel around. So yeah, use manual focus. You're thinking, why use manual focus for bird photography? That's insane. He's gone insane. You should use autofocus all the time. There are some situations where the autofocus just might not keep up, and the main one is that the bird is flying directly towards you. It's flying very fast directly towards you and the camera. That's the most difficult situation for the camera to cope with. Now with some of the newer cameras and lenses, yes, it may cope okay. Some of the newer systems are amazing, and a bird flying straight towards the camera, it might do the job absolutely fine. With some of the older cameras and lenses, it's probably going to struggle much more. So if that's the case and it's not keeping up, then what I would try is to switch to manual focus. So similar to number one, you're going to imagine roughly where you want the bird to be. Hopefully you've seen the bird do the same flight path a couple of times. If not, you're just going to have to judge it. You're going to focus on the ground. So you're going to pick a point on the ground roughly at the same distance, and you're going to focus on that. And then you're going to keep it on manual focus. We're not going to switch back to auto. And then the trick is, as the bird flies towards that point of focus, you want to start firing. So the crucial thing is that you start firing just before it enters that point of focus, and not once it gets there, else you'll probably be too slow. So yeah, fire away, keep it on continuous shooting as fast as your camera can do. Just before it hits that zone of focus, fire away, and that is sometimes the best way of coping with this type of situation. So if you are struggling, if you think your camera's struggling with head-on subjects, then switch it onto manual and give it a go that way instead. Tip number three is to keep both eyes open. So I think a lot of people will look through the viewfinder with one eye and they'll keep the other eye closed. I think that's what I used to do. What I prefer to do now is to keep both eyes open when I'm shooting. So I'm looking through the camera, through the viewfinder with my right eye, but my left eye stays open, and I'm kind of able to use both, and I find this works really well. So I've mentioned this in the past, but I don't think I've mentioned it in relation to flight photography. The reason it could help with flight photography is it might help you, if you can't find the bird at first, it might help you just to kind of look for a reference point, maybe a tree for example, with your left eye, and then give you an idea where you are to pick up the bird in flight. Also, it can be useful to know what's actually going on. So if you're just looking through the camera with one eye, then you can't see anything else. That's all you're going to see is through the viewfinder. But your other eye, if you keep that open, you can kind of see what's going on outside. And that can be really good if something else is going to happen. Say another bird's going to come into view, for example. Another bird's about to come into the viewfinder and you want to be able to react to that. So maybe there's a few birds around, maybe there's another bird, maybe it's going to come in to mob the bird you're photographing, for example. If you can see what's coming, just that, literally that split second or a second, whatever it is, just giving you a bit of warning, will enable you to react faster. If you just keep the eye shut, then you probably find you can't react quick enough to something that happens. Give that a go. Some people I know found it difficult. I really like it. I get on with it well. Tip number 4 is to use the wind, and this is probably one of the things that improve my birds in flight photography more than anything, I think. So it's really important that you understand how the wind affects things. Now, birds will generally prefer to take off and land into the wind. This is because it gives them more control and more stability. So if you're going out for bird photography, and certainly for birds in flight photography, then do try and make a note of the wind direction. It's really helpful. If you know which direction the wind is going before you get on location, that's even better. So that's definitely going to help you in terms of which direction the bird's going to go if it's landing or taking off. Now, if we imagine if a bird wanted to go this way, which is west at the moment, if it wanted to go this way and the wind was coming from the west, then that's great because the bird is going to take off into the wind, it's going to go in that direction. But what if it wanted to go east? What would it do? Well, the likelihood is it would probably still take off in the same direction because it wants to fly into the wind, but what it's going to then do is just bank round to go to the direction that it's aiming for. So do bear that in mind as well. I would say this advice works about 90% of the time, but there are some situations where it won't apply. So one situation is where the bird just doesn't really have room. There's very little room to manoeuvre, and the bird isn't able to kind of change direction, fly round, bank into the wind in order to come into land. So a really good example of this would be seabirds that nest on cliff ledges by the coast. So they can pretty much only come in from one direction, which is off the sea. So it's not really going to matter which direction the wind is blowing. Now, in this situation, it can actually work in your favour. It would be better for the wind to be coming off the sea behind the birds. What happens then is that it kind of, because it's forcing the bird so much towards the cliff, coming from behind the bird has to flap really strongly in order to slow down. So it kind of has to put on the brakes, and that can lead to some really excellent poses. Sometimes you get ruffled feathers, and this can be some of the best pictures you can get. Tip number 5, the last tip in this video, is to try and get to a similar level as the bird. Now, I know this is really difficult to do because we can't fly. If you can get to a similar level, a bit higher up, it can really help your images. The reason being is that the lighting's just better if you're not pointing upwards quite so much, and you're less likely to get those shadows underneath the bird, those annoying shadows. So if there are areas a little higher, banks, hillsides maybe you can get on, you might be able to get close to the bird in flight. I think in some places there might even be towers. You think of bird hides, for example, on nature reserves. In some countries in Europe, I think they maybe have some towers on flight paths for this reason. I've never tried them, but it sounds good. I've managed to get to a similar level for photographing my geese flocks, which I'll be doing very soon. So I've kind of found a hillside which puts me higher up, which is kind of on a rough flight path of the geese, and just that extra elevation has really made a difference in getting pictures of those birds in flight. Also, what I'd say is think about going back to number 4, think about the takeoff and landing of birds, because that's kind of flight photography as well, but the bonus is they're already going to be at a similar level, so you're not going to be shooting up against the sky. So think about photographing the birds when they're taking off and landing, get some really interesting poses, some different wing positions, and spread feathers and tails. Thanks very much for watching the video, and I will see you somewhere, sometime soon. Birds will generally prefer to take off and land into the wind. Imagine an aeroplane trying to land with the wind behind it, or from the side, wind shear. I watch a lot of air crash investigation.